Last week, I talked about Need for Speed Most Wanted, the 2012 game that came out on a lot of platforms, but I feel like was largely forgotten. It came out on things like the PlayStation Vita and the Wii U, which were both systems that around this time had relatively small libraries when it was all said and done, and are systems that are held in high regard by the people who love these consoles still today. And it seems like around this time, there were a lot of games that kind of got released on a lot of platforms, but ultimately kind of just fell short of being remembered fondly by a wider audience. And I think 2014 is a great example of that. The year 2014 is a particularly weak one, in my opinion, for overall video games being released. This is hot off the heels of the 2013 release of the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. We're just new into these consoles, and their first year was very weak. I remember owning an Xbox One that first summer after it got released, so maybe 9 months out from release I picked one up. I was playing Dead Rising 3, I was playing Madden 25, and there was really nothing else for me to play until Destiny came out. And that really is the big game of 2014 in retrospect. That and Titanfall. However, interestingly, both of these games are relatively pointless to play or purchase now because they were so heavily reliant on online components. Back in 2014, we were already creating online-heavy games that are now essentially not even worth the disc that they're printed on. So besides those two big titles this year, Destiny and Titanfall, I want to talk about some of the other titles that released in 2014 that I think are good games, but have been forgotten kind of by the sands of time. And first up for the year is Bravely Default, which of course released on the 3DS, Japanese RPG. Not something that I'm personally into, but obviously there is a lot of fanfare around this series, at least in the community that it has, and it did see a follow-up release on the Nintendo Switch. This is a game that I think got relatively overlooked on the 3DS, as many of these 3DS, Wii U, and Vita games from this era tended to get overlooked. And you also see this problem in 2014 where games are still releasing exclusively on the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, and that's not a problem. I mean, I owned a 360 then too, but those that had purchased new consoles wanted to move on. They wanted to play that new console, and unlike now where a game might have released, in 2020 on the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 and not had a next-gen version, you could still at least play that game on your next-gen console. That backwards compatibility was not here on the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. When these games were released in 2014 on the PS3 and the 360, you had to play them on an actual PS3 or 360, and that's hampering to these games' sales and ultimately their legacy. And obviously Lightning Returns Final Fantasy 13 is a follow-up title of Final Fantasy 13, which was already a controversial game in the fact that a lot of people didn't like just how linear it was. This was a follow-up game of that. I think this was the third game in the Final Fantasy 13 trilogy of sorts, and obviously it's going to have continually sold worse as each subsequent game came out, so that's probably why this one is the one you hear about the least among the three. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is one of those Wii U games that I think was a good game, was a great reboot of the Donkey Kong Country franchise, and of course is well overshadowed by the fact that it's today released on Switch, and that is obviously the more popular version. Plants vs. Zombies Garden Warfare was a third-person online shooter that I thoroughly enjoyed. I believe you can technically still play this today. It was released on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, PS3, and Xbox 360, all those platforms, as a online exclusive title for the most part. I don't think there was much offline content here, so while I do say that I think this game is still playable because it is part of EA Play and they have it on there, you can download it, I don't think many people are necessarily playing this game online anymore. Another one of arguably the big games for 2014 was kind of not really a full game in itself. It's one that only took a handful of hours to complete, is my understanding. And that's Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zero, which was kind of the prequel lead up into the Phantom Pain, and a game that felt more like a demo to a lot of people because it wasn't a full-length release. It didn't sell for a full price as far as I remember. Infamous Second Son was a PlayStation 4 exclusive that was a follow-up to the two Infamous games that came out on the PlayStation 3, and I think that had I have owned a PlayStation 4 at the time, I probably would have found a great deal of nostalgia and interest for this one. Then what we all would have thought would have been the biggest game of 2014 was Watch Dogs. This one was overhyped into oblivion, and ultimately Watch Dogs today, I feel like as a franchise in its entirety, even with Legion having came out, a couple years ago, it's not what I would consider a very big franchise. And ultimately the first Watch Dogs game is not something that I think a lot of people will want to go back to in 10 years because it's just really not as innovative as you would have anticipated the game would have been. Following that up is Mario Kart 8. Obviously, this was a very good Wii U game. I think that most people who owned a Wii U got their hands on Mario Kart 8, but ultimately, as we know, this got re-released on Switch, became insanely more popular there, and has received even additional DLC that did not come on the Wii U version. Then another one that released, only on the PS3 and the 360. I can still find sealed copies of this at Five Below today because they couldn't seem to sell out of all of them. Borderlands, the pre-sequel, which just kind of another Borderlands game. Feels like it could have been DLC for one of the other titles. But regardless, this was a big deal for people that enjoyed the Borderlands franchise, maybe hadn't moved to next gen yet. They probably find this game to be very fondly remembered. Then Sunset Overdrive was, in my opinion, the first big Xbox One exclusive where, if you were trying to debate which console was better between the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 in 2014, this was one of your arguments for the Xbox One being better. Sunset Overdrive, which was made by a team that went on to make the Spider-Man game for the PlayStation 4, is a very cool action platforming game that I think has it's kind of slipped to irrelevancy as this IP was never followed up on with a Sunset Overdrive 2, likely in part because the team was no longer there. Then Assassin's Creed Unity, which is probably one of the most hated Assassin's Creed games of all time, came out this year, which is only really worth noting for the fact that if 2014 is an example of a bad video game year of the 2010s and 2000s, it's the year that Assassin's Creed Unity came out rather than any other Assassin's Creed game. Halo the Master Chief Collection, though, while being a re-release of all the previous Halo games, is a great package with a ton of content in that's even worth picking up today. Here, something like 8 years later, the Master Chief Collection is still worth a purchase and still has gotten updates to move it forward to the next generation of consoles. There were a lot of re-releases in general in 2014, but I think that this one was definitely the best package. Then a franchise that started in 2014 that I didn't look at for quite a few years later. It's from the Lord of the Rings world. It's Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, a game that it was based off of kind of the combat system that you saw in the Batman Arkham games. It was another Warner Brothers game, actually, because of that licensing. It's a good game, and it's a game that I think people don't really give as much attention to as they should. I think that Shadow of War is a better game. I think that that's a controversial statement because a lot of people do think Shadow of Mordor seems to be better, but the Nemesis system in this game and the way that you could run into an enemy, have them remember their interaction, just kind of create rivalries that were very organic to your personal save file, made this be a very exciting game, and that Nemesis system has not been well replicated since. I mean, they try to do it with some of the Assassin's Creed titles. It's just not the same. They can't quite line it up the same way Shadow of Mordor had in their two games. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, I said the Master Chief Collection is the best re-release of 2014, but this is the best remake of 2014 in my opinion. I enjoyed these games as a kid, so getting to replay them in 2014 on the 3DS with quality of life enhancements was definitely a huge, just nostalgic experience for me. And then Kingdom Hearts HD 2.5 Remix. I loved Kingdom Hearts 2 far more than the 1.5 remix. I wasn't as big into the first Kingdom Hearts game. So for this to get released on 2014 on the PS3, and only the PS3, to the surprise, I think, of a lot of people at the time, because, you could have ported it forward one more time, you think, and they did eventually. But for 2014, it was just on the PlayStation 3, Kingdom Hearts HD Remix 2.5. So those were the games that were released in 2014 that I think were substantial, were worth talking about. And as you can see, there weren't a lot of good games that released in 2014. I mean, there were a lot of average games. There were a lot of re-releases that maybe turned out to be the definitive version of a game. But 2014 was a weird year because we were stuck in this limbo, kind of almost like we feel like we are now, where some games were still releasing for the old platforms, which was more of a problem than it is now because you had to have the old platform to play those titles. but then the games that were coming forward also just kind of didn't feel like they were all intended for the new platform yet, and that's kind of the problem that we have right now. We're not seeing a lot of PS5 games that were totally made from the ground up for the PlayStation 5 quite yet, because the systems haven't been out long enough. They were made with a multi-generational approach, and that's an issue for people who bought into newer consoles. They want that new console experience, and it takes a couple years for that to come around. What are your thoughts on the games released in 2014? Are there any that I missed that you really fondly remember? Let me know down in the comments section. I'm Bailey, and I will see you in the next video.